What would you do if everyone told you to sell your family's ranch? Because a young woman could never run it alone. When 21-year-old Abigail Turner inherited her father's struggling Montana ranch, the bank laughed, the town doubted her, and experts told her to walk away before she lost everything. But hidden inside an old journal her father left behind was a secret buried beneath decades of hard work. What Abigail discovered would not only save the ranch, it would transform her into one of the most successful landowners in the state. And before this story is over, you'll see how faith, patience, and a father's wisdom can change a life forever. Cold autumn winds swept across the endless grasslands outside Miles City, Montana. Gray clouds drifted low above the rolling hills, while golden prairie grass bent beneath the season's first warning of winter. At 21 years old, Abigail Turner stood alone near the fence line of Turner Ranch, staring across nearly 300 acres of land that suddenly belonged entirely to her. 3 weeks earlier, she had still been someone's daughter. Now she was completely alone. The funeral flowers had already begun to die. The sympathy calls had stopped. The casseroles neighbors brought during the first few days had disappeared from her refrigerator. Life was moving on for everyone else. Except Abigail. She remained trapped in the moment when her father collapsed beside the cattle loading pens. Ethan Turner had been 58 years old. A tall, broad-shouldered rancher with weathered skin, steel blue eyes, and a thick gray beard that made him look older than he actually was. Decades of sun, wind, and hard work had carved deep lines into his face, but his smile had always remained warm. People respected Ethan because he rarely complained and always kept his word. To Abigail, he had been more than a father. He had been her teacher, her best friend, and the only person who truly believed in her. The heart attack came without warning. One moment, he was checking feed inventory. The next, he was gone. Abigail still replayed that day every night. She wondered whether she could have called for help sooner, whether she should have noticed some hidden sign, whether somehow she could have changed the outcome. The questions never produced answers, only guilt. A sudden gust of wind swept across the pasture. Hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The sight should have comforted her. Instead, it filled her with anxiety. Because the ranch was running out of money. Feed costs had risen dramatically. Equipment repairs were overdue. Several water systems needed maintenance before winter arrived. The numbers were brutal. The ranch account contained less than $8,000. Expenses over the next 2 months would exceed 4 times that amount. Abigail knew exactly what needed to be done. She needed a loan. The following morning, she drove into Miles City. Her aging white ranch pickup bounced across the gravel roads leading into town. Dust covered the doors. The passenger seat held a worn leather notebook that once belonged to Ethan. Abigail carried it everywhere, not because it contained solutions, because it reminded her she wasn't completely alone. The First Montana Agricultural Bank occupied a large brick building near downtown. As Abigail entered, several local ranchers immediately recognized her. Most had attended her father's funeral. Some nodded politely. Others simply watched. The young woman walking toward the loan office was about to become the subject of conversation throughout the county. Abigail possessed a quiet confidence that often made people underestimate her. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall with a lean frame shaped by years of ranch work rather than gym memberships. Her long dark blonde hair was usually tied into a practical ponytail. Her green eyes carried intelligence and determination, though lately exhaustion had darkened the skin beneath them. Unlike many people her age, Abigail had never dreamed of leaving Montana. She loved the land too much. Unfortunately, loving something didn't guarantee you could save it. Inside the loan office sat Gerald Whitaker. Gerald was 62 years old and had served as the bank's agricultural lending director for nearly 3 decades. He possessed thinning silver hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, sharp brown eyes, and the cautious personality of a man who trusted numbers more than people. Years of watching farms fail had made him skeptical of optimism, especially young optimism. He reviewed Abigail's paperwork silently. The room remained quiet for nearly 5 minutes. Finally, he removed his glasses. "This isn't personal, Abigail." She immediately knew what was coming. Gerald folded his hands. "The bank can't approve this loan." The words landed exactly as hard as she expected. Abigail swallowed. "Why?" Gerald glanced toward the financial reports. "Your father was the operation." The statement hurt, but he continued. "You have no independent management history. You've never run a ranch this size. The risk is simply too high. Abigail felt frustration building. I've worked this ranch my entire life. Gerald sighed. Working isn't the same as leading. Several ranchers seated nearby overheard the conversation. One of them chuckled. Another shook his head. An older cattle owner named Marvin Holt leaned back in his chair. Marvin was nearly 70, heavy-set, bald, and known throughout the county for his blunt opinions. Kid, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, sell the place while you still can. A few men laughed. Abigail felt heat rise into her face. Marvin continued, this country eats experienced ranchers alive. He gestured toward the window. You really think a 21-year-old girl can handle 300 acres by herself? More laughter followed. Not cruel laughter. Worse, pity. Abigail looked around the room. Nobody defended her. Nobody challenged Marvin. Several people even nodded in agreement. For the first time since her father's death, genuine fear entered her heart. Not fear of hard work. Not fear of failure. Fear that they might be right. Yet as she stood to leave, her eyes drifted toward the worn leather notebook resting beneath her arm. The notebook her father carried almost every day of his life. A strange feeling settled inside her. Maybe everyone in that room saw a young woman destined to lose everything. But somewhere deep inside, Abigail refused to believe her father's story, and hers, would end this way. She walked out of the bank beneath the dark Montana sky, carrying rejection, uncertainty, and a growing determination that even she didn't fully understand. And before winter arrived, she would discover that her father had left behind far more than a struggling ranch. Cold winds swept across the eastern Montana plains as dark clouds gathered above Miles City. The scent of approaching snow lingered in the air while abandoned wheat fields shimmered beneath a pale autumn sun. 3 days after leaving the bank, Abigail Turner found herself standing among nearly 200 people gathered at a bankruptcy auction outside Forsyth, Montana. The irony wasn't lost on her. Most people attended auctions hoping to expand. Abigail was there simply trying to survive. The auction belonged to Carson Ridge Ranch, a large cattle operation that had collapsed under debt after several years of poor market conditions. Trucks, tractors, hay balers, livestock trailers, irrigation systems, generators, and thousands of dollars worth of equipment stretched across the property. Every rancher in eastern Montana seemed to be there. Abigail parked her old pickup near the back and stepped out into the cold morning air. She carried a notebook, a pen, and a strict spending limit. $5,000. That was almost everything she could risk. The crowd moved toward the machinery section where the most valuable equipment sat lined up in neat rows. A massive green tractor immediately attracted dozens of bidders. Nearby, ranchers argued over combines and hay balers. Abigail walked past them all. Several people noticed. Most assumed she simply couldn't afford anything worth buying. Unfortunately, they were right. As she moved farther into the auction grounds, she noticed a neglected corner near the rear fence. Broken equipment, rusting machinery, parts nobody seemed interested in. That was where Abigail stopped. An old irrigation control system sat partially covered by a tarp. Rust stained much of the metal housing, but something caught her attention. The main structure remained intact. Nearby stood 3 industrial generators. All were labeled non-operational. Most buyers ignored them completely. Leaning against an old shed sat a battered service truck with faded paint and over 200,000 miles on the odometer. Everyone else saw junk. Abigail saw possibilities. Years of working beside her father had taught her something valuable. Ethan Turner rarely threw anything away. Not because he was cheap, because he understood machines. Many broken things weren't truly broken. They simply needed patience. As she crouched beside one of the generators, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Shopping for scrap metal now. Abigail looked up. Marvin Holt stood nearby. The older rancher wore a thick canvas jacket and weathered cowboy hat. His round face carried the same amused expression she remembered from the bank. Several other ranchers stood behind him. They were clearly entertained. Abigail calmly stood. Just looking. Marvin chuckled. Looks like that's all you'll be doing. The men laughed. One younger rancher stepped forward. His name was Luke Dawson. Luke was 32 years old, tall and athletic with sandy blonde hair, light stubble along his jaw, and sharp blue eyes. Unlike Marvin, there was no cruelty in his expression. He simply looked curious. Luke managed one of the larger cattle operations in the region and had earned a reputation as a capable businessman despite his age. "You seriously thinking about buying that stuff?" Luke asked. Abigail nodded. "Maybe." Luke glanced toward the rusted generators. "Those haven't run in years." "Maybe." "The truck's probably headed for a junkyard." "Maybe." Luke laughed. For the first time, Abigail found herself smiling. The auction eventually reached the neglected equipment section. The auctioneer barely hid his boredom. Bids came slowly. Many items received none at all. When the irrigation system appeared, Abigail raised her hand. No one challenged her. The entire system sold for less than $600. Next came the generators. Again, nobody bid. Abigail purchased all three. The crowd began whispering. Then came the service truck. The engine barely started. Blue smoke poured from the exhaust. Several people openly laughed. Abigail bought it anyway. By the end of the auction, she had spent less than half her budget. Yet she now owned an irrigation system, 3 generators, and a utility truck. To everyone else, it looked ridiculous. As buyers loaded expensive equipment onto trailers, Marvin approached one final time. He glanced toward Abigail's purchases. "Kid," he said with a grin, "I hope you know what you're doing." Abigail looked across the auction yard. Truthfully, she wasn't entirely sure. But then she remembered something her father used to say whenever a repair seemed impossible. The value of a thing isn't determined by how it looks on its worst day. For a brief moment, she could almost hear Ethan's voice. Abigail climbed into her pickup. The laughter continued behind her. Nobody noticed the small smile forming on her face. Because for the first time since her father's death, she wasn't reacting to circumstances. She was making a plan. And somewhere inside the worn leather notebook resting on the passenger seat, answers her father left behind were still waiting to be discovered. A sharp autumn wind rattled the walls of the old barn while dark clouds drifted across the Montana sky, and the scent of approaching snow lingered over the empty pastures. The laughter from the auction followed Abigail Turner all the way home. Every time she unloaded another piece of rusted equipment, she could almost hear Marvin Holt's voice asking whether she had lost her mind. By sunset, the old irrigation system sat beside the machine shed. The generators rested beneath a tarp, and the battered service truck occupied a corner of the yard. To most people, it looked like a collection of junk. To Abigail, it looked like opportunity. Still, opportunity wouldn't pay feed bills. That reality haunted her as she walked through the ranch that evening. Winter was approaching quickly. The cattle needed hay. Several water systems needed repairs. And despite her optimism, she still had no clear solution. Unable to sleep, Abigail grabbed a flashlight and wandered toward the large red barn behind the main house. The structure had stood there for nearly 50 years. Her father spent countless evenings inside repairing equipment, sharpening tools, and recording notes after long days in the field. Since his death, Abigail had avoided the place. Too many memories lived there. But tonight something pulled her inside. The old wooden doors groaned as she stepped through. Dust floated through the flashlight beam. The scent of oil, leather, and aged timber instantly reminded her of Ethan Turner. For several moments, she simply stood there, listening, remembering. She could almost hear her father's voice explaining how engines worked. Almost see him sitting at the workbench with a cup of coffee. Almost believe he might walk through the door again. Near the back of the barn stood a storage loft filled with forgotten boxes. Abigail climbed the narrow staircase. Most of the items had not been touched in years. Old saddles, broken tools, feed records, family keepsakes. Then she noticed something unusual beneath a canvas tarp. A large wooden chest. The chest looked ancient. Dark oak reinforced with iron bands. Its surface carried decades of scratches and weather damage. Abigail frowned. She had never seen it before. Curiosity quickly replaced exhaustion. She pulled away the tarp. A layer of dust covered the lid. When she lifted it open, her breath caught. Inside were dozens of notebooks. Not 2, not 10, dozens. Every one labeled by year. And continuing all the way to the year of her father's death. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she picked up the oldest notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting. Temperatures, rainfall records, snowfall patterns, groundwater measurements, grass growth observations, cattle migration behavior. Every detail had been recorded. Every season, every year. The realization stunned her. Her father had spent more than 20 years studying the land. Not casually. obsessively, as if he had been conducting a scientific experiment. Abigail carried several notebooks downstairs and sat at the old workbench. Hours passed. She barely noticed. The deeper she read, the more astonishing the records became. Ethan had mapped underground water movement, tracked drought cycles, documented how specific grazing patterns affected grass recovery, recorded locations where vegetation remained healthy during dry years. Many of his observations stretched across decades. Some included hand-drawn maps. Others contained predictions that had later proven accurate. For the first time, Abigail realized her father had understood the ranch in ways she never imagined. Near midnight, she reached the final notebook, the last one he ever wrote. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Several pages near the end appeared different. The writing had become shakier, as though Ethan knew his time was running short. One folded document slipped from between the pages. Inside was a map, a detailed map of Turner Ranch. Certain areas were circled in red ink. Others contained notes she did not yet understand. At the bottom appeared a handwritten message. Abigail stared at the familiar handwriting. Tears slowly filled her eyes. The message read, "If one day I'm no longer here, trust this land. It is stronger than people think." She swallowed hard, then continued reading. The next paragraph felt almost like a conversation. "I know there will be people who tell you to quit. I know there will be people who believe this ranch cannot survive. They don't know what I know." Abigail's chest tightened. It felt as though her father was sitting beside her, still teaching, still guiding, still believing. Outside, wind rattled the barn walls. Inside, something changed. For weeks, she had been reacting to problems, reacting to grief, reacting to fear. Now she possessed something far more valuable than money. Knowledge. 20 years of it. As dawn approached, Abigail closed the final notebook and looked across the sleeping ranch outside the barn window. For the first time since Ethan's death, she no longer felt abandoned. Because hidden inside an old chest, her father had left behind more than records. He had left behind a roadmap. And somewhere within those pages lay the secret that would determine whether Turner Ranch survived or became just another Montana failure. The first major snowstorm arrived before Thanksgiving. Arctic winds swept across eastern Montana while dark clouds buried the horizon and temperatures plunged far below normal. By early December, Turner Ranch looked nothing like it had a month earlier. Snow covered the pastures. Fence lines disappeared beneath drifts. Water troughs froze overnight. Even experienced ranchers began worrying. Abigail Turner spent most mornings before sunrise breaking ice, checking cattle, and studying her father's notebooks by lantern light. Exhaustion became part of her daily routine. Some nights, she slept barely 4 hours. Yet something inside her had changed since discovering Ethan's records. For the first time since his death, she no longer felt completely lost. One evening, she spread several maps across the kitchen table. The same red circles her father had marked continued appearing in certain sections of the ranch. One area in particular caught her attention: a rocky valley near the northern boundary. Most ranchers avoided it because the ground was uneven and difficult to access. According to Ethan's notes, however, the location remained green longer than surrounding pastures during dry years. Even more interesting, groundwater measurements appeared repeatedly throughout 20 years of records. Abigail frowned. Why would her father spend decades measuring the same location? The next morning, she decided to find out. Wrapped in heavy winter clothing, she drove the battered service truck she had purchased at auction. After several hours navigating snow-covered trails, she finally reached the valley. The place looked lifeless. Snow covered everything. Wind howled between rock formations. At first, she thought she had wasted her time. Then she noticed something strange. Near the base of a hillside, several patches of grass remained visible despite the freezing temperatures. Not much, but enough. Her pulse quickened. She stepped closer. The ground beneath her boots felt softer, warmer, almost alive. Following her father's notes, she began probing several marked locations. By late afternoon, she discovered what Ethan had been documenting for decades: underground water. Not a small pocket, a significant source. Water slowly moved beneath the surface year-round, protected from freezing by geological formations beneath the valley. Abigail stood in silence. The answer had been hidden on her own property all along. For the next several weeks, she worked relentlessly. Using salvaged parts from the auction equipment, she repaired sections of the irrigation system. One of the generators eventually came back to life after dozens of frustrating hours spent replacing damaged components. The work was difficult. Many repairs failed. Others succeeded only after repeated attempts. But little by little, the system improved. By January, fresh water reached several areas of pasture that had previously been inaccessible during winter. Then the real crisis began. The harshest winter in nearly 15 years settled across Montana. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees. Blizzards shut down roads. Hay prices skyrocketed. Across the region, ranchers faced impossible choices. Many began selling cattle. Others liquidated portions of their herds simply to survive. One afternoon, Abigail stopped in Miles City for supplies. The atmosphere felt different. Tension hung over every conversation. At the feed store, she overheard ranchers discussing emergency livestock sales. Even Marvin Holt looked worried. The confident man who once laughed at her now appeared exhausted. Deep lines surrounded his eyes. His normally booming voice sounded strained. For the first time, Abigail realized the crisis was affecting everyone, not just her. Outside the store, she encountered Luke Dawson again. Snowflakes drifted through the air as he loaded feed into his trailer. Luke looked tired. His sandy hair disappeared beneath a wool cap, and several days of stubble covered his jaw. "How are your cattle holding up?" he asked. Abigail hesitated. "Better than expected." Luke nodded slowly. "So I've heard." She looked surprised. "Heard what?" Luke leaned against the trailer. "People are talking." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Luke smiled faintly. "Apparently your cattle are gaining weight, while everyone else's are losing it." She didn't answer. Luke studied her for a moment. There was admiration in his eyes now. Not curiosity. Not skepticism. Respect. "You found something out there, didn't you?" Abigail glanced toward the distant mountains. For a brief moment, she considered telling him everything. Instead, she smiled. "My father left good notes." Luke laughed. "Best answer I've heard all winter." Weeks later, while neighboring ranches struggled to maintain basic water supplies, Turner Ranch continued operating. The cattle remained healthy. The pastures remained productive. And for the first time since Ethan Turner died, Abigail began believing the ranch might actually survive. Because hidden beneath the frozen Montana earth was a resource most people never knew existed. And hidden within her father's notebooks was knowledge worth more than any loan the bank could have given her. The worst of winter had finally begun to loosen its grip on Montana. Snow still covered portions of the prairie, but patches of brown grass had started emerging beneath the pale spring sunlight. For most ranchers, survival had become the only victory that mattered. For Abigail Turner, however, new questions had begun to emerge. The underground water source her father discovered was far larger than she originally believed. The evidence sat right in front of her. Even after weeks of supplying water to multiple sections of Turner Ranch, the water levels never seemed to decline. According to Ethan's notebooks, this shouldn't have been possible, unless something much larger existed beneath the property. One evening, Abigail sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by maps. The same red markings appeared repeatedly in one particular section of the ranch. Ironically, it was the land everyone considered worthless. The northern flats. Rocky, uneven, difficult to graze, poor soil. For decades, neighboring ranchers mocked that section of Turner Ranch. Some even joked that Ethan had overpaid for useless acreage. Yet Ethan continued marking it year after year, page after page, observation after observation, measurement after measurement. The pattern felt deliberate. Abigail finally made a decision. She would dig. The following week, she hired a drilling contractor from Miles City. The owner, Randall Pierce, was a 63-year-old well driller with weathered skin, thick gray eyebrows, and hands permanently stained from decades of mechanical work. Randall rarely spoke more than necessary, but people trusted him because he never exaggerated results. After 40 years drilling wells throughout Montana, he had seen almost every type of geological formation imaginable. Almost. When Abigail showed him Ethan's maps, he studied them carefully. Then he looked at her. "Your father kept excellent records." Abigail smiled. "He always believed there was something here." Randall nodded slowly. "Let's find out." 3 days later, the drilling rig arrived. Several curious neighbors appeared almost immediately, including Marvin Holt. The older rancher leaned against his truck, watching the operation with obvious skepticism. "Still chasing fairy tales?" he called out. Abigail ignored him. The drilling began shortly after sunrise. The first 100 feet revealed nothing unusual. The second 100 produced similar results. By late afternoon, even Randall appeared uncertain. Then everything changed. At nearly 400 feet, pressure readings suddenly surged. Workers exchanged confused looks. Equipment readings jumped. Moments later, a powerful column of water erupted from the drill site. The force stunned everyone. For several seconds, nobody moved. Water surged into the air before crashing back toward the earth. Randall removed his helmet and stared. His expression told Abigail everything. This wasn't normal. Within days, additional test wells confirmed the discovery. The underground reservoir extended far beyond the original drilling location, far beyond anything Ethan had estimated. News traveled quickly. Soon state officials arrived. Hydrologists followed. Engineers conducted independent studies. One of them was Dr. Eleanor Walsh. Eleanor was 50 years old, tall and slender with short silver-streaked brown hair, intelligent gray eyes, and a calm professional demeanor. As one of Montana's leading groundwater specialists, she had spent 2 decades studying aquifers throughout the western United States. Her reputation for accuracy made her one of the most respected experts in her field. After reviewing the data, Eleanor requested a private meeting with Abigail. The two women stood overlooking the drill site beneath a bright spring sky. Eleanor held several reports in her hand. "You need to understand something," she said carefully. Abigail felt nervous. "What is it?" Eleanor looked toward the valley. "This aquifer is enormous." Abigail remained silent. Eleanor continued. "Potentially large enough to support agricultural operations throughout this region for decades." The words barely felt real. Abigail stared at her. "You mean my ranch?" Eleanor shook her head. "No." Then she pointed toward the distant horizon. "I mean this entire area." For a moment, Abigail could only listen to the wind. Everything around her suddenly felt different. The land everyone mocked. The land banks valued poorly. The land neighboring ranchers avoided. It had been hiding one of the most important resources in eastern Montana. And somehow her father knew. Within months, property investors began calling. Agricultural companies expressed interest. Energy firms requested meetings. Even the bank that rejected her loan wanted to discuss new opportunities. Land values throughout Turner Ranch increased dramatically. Some parcels were suddenly worth 10 times their previous estimates. Yet none of that affected Abigail as deeply as something else. One evening she returned to the barn and opened Ethan's final notebook. There, written beside one of the last maps, she found a sentence she had somehow overlooked. "The value of land is rarely found on the surface." Abigail smiled through tears. The world believed her father left behind a struggling ranch. Instead, he had left behind a future. And hidden beneath the most overlooked corner of Turner Ranch was proof that sometimes the greatest treasures are buried exactly where everyone else stops looking. A dry wind swept across eastern Montana beneath a cloudless summer sky. The grasslands that once rolled green across the horizon now carried shades of yellow and brown as another year of drought tightened its grip on the region. 2 years had passed since the discovery beneath Turner Ranch. For most ranchers, those 2 years had been devastating. For Abigail Turner, they had changed everything. The drought that began as a difficult season had grown into one of the longest dry periods Montana had experienced in decades. Reservoirs shrank. Wells failed. Grazing land disappeared. Entire herds were sold because owners could no longer afford to feed them. Across eastern Montana, bankruptcy notices became common. Abigail saw the effects everywhere. Abandoned machinery sat beside empty barns. Auction signs appeared along highways. Families who had worked the same land for generations quietly packed their belongings and left. Each loss reminded her how close Turner Ranch had once come to the same fate. One afternoon, she stood atop a ridge overlooking her property. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While neighboring fields struggled, her cattle grazed on healthy pasture supported by the groundwater system Ethan had documented decades earlier. The irrigation equipment everyone mocked now operated almost continuously. The old generators still ran. The service truck she purchased at auction remained in use every week. For the first time in years, Turner Ranch was profitable. Not because Abigail had become lucky, because she had listened. The first visitor arrived early that summer. Then another. Then another. People who once doubted her suddenly wanted meetings. Some wanted advice. Others wanted access to water. Many simply wanted answers. One of them was Marvin Holt. The older rancher looked very different from the man who mocked her at the bank. His shoulders seemed smaller. His face carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years fighting circumstances beyond his control. When he arrived at Turner Ranch, he removed his hat before speaking. That alone surprised Abigail. "I owe you an apology." Abigail remained silent. Marvin stared toward the cattle. "I thought your father spoiled you." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out he was teaching you." The words carried no sarcasm, only honesty. For a moment, Abigail remembered the laughter inside the bank, the humiliation, the doubt. Yet she felt no anger, only understanding. Marvin had spent his entire life believing experience guaranteed wisdom. The drought had taught him otherwise. Over the following months, more ranchers came seeking advice. Abigail shared what she could. She explained grazing patterns, water management, pasture rotation. Many of the lessons came directly from Ethan's notebooks. Others came from mistakes she made herself. Word spread quickly. Soon agricultural publications began writing articles about Turner Ranch. State officials visited. University researchers requested access to study the aquifer. Then came the investors. The first offer arrived by certified mail. Abigail almost laughed when she saw the number. 10 times the land's previous value. The second offer came from an agricultural development company. The third came from a water investment group. Each proposal exceeded the last. One company even offered enough money for Abigail to retire before turning 30. Friends told her she would be foolish not to sell. Bankers encouraged negotiations. Consultants promised financial security. Yet every offer created the same reaction: discomfort. One evening, Abigail sat in the barn reviewing Ethan's notebooks. The familiar smell of old wood surrounded her. As she turned another page, a folded note slipped free. She recognized her father's handwriting immediately. The message was short, simple, direct. Land is not something we own. It's something we protect until the next generation arrives. Abigail read the sentence several times. The words lingered. Days later, another visitor appeared. His name was Victor Langley. Victor was 58 years old, tall and sharply dressed, with silver hair combed perfectly into place and piercing gray eyes that missed very little. He represented one of the largest investment firms in the western United States. Throughout his career, he had purchased struggling agricultural properties, consolidated them, and sold them for enormous profits. He possessed a reputation for always getting what he wanted. Victor arrived carrying an offer unlike any before. When he finished presenting the proposal, silence filled the room. The amount was staggering, enough to change multiple lifetimes. Victor smiled confidently. "No one would blame you for accepting." Abigail looked through the barn window toward the distant pastures. The same land her father spent decades studying. The same land everyone once considered worthless. The same land that saved the ranch. Finally, she turned back toward him. "I'm not interested." For the first time all afternoon, Victor appeared genuinely surprised. Abigail smiled politely. "Some things aren't for sale." As Victor left, Abigail felt an unexpected sense of peace, because she finally understood something her father had known all along. The true value of Turner Ranch was never measured by what someone was willing to pay. It was measured by what future generations might lose if she sold it. A warm spring wind moved across the Montana prairie while distant storm clouds drifted along the horizon and sunlight shimmered across the green pastures surrounding Turner Ranch. Nearly 3 years had passed since Abigail Turner first walked out of the bank carrying rejection instead of a loan. Now reporters occasionally called asking for interviews. Agricultural journals published articles about her ranch. University researchers visited regularly to study the aquifer beneath her land. Yet despite the growing attention, Abigail remained focused on the same things her father had always valued: the cattle, the grass, the water, and the land. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the northern boundary, she noticed an unfamiliar pickup truck approaching the ranch house. The vehicle was old, older than hers. Dust covered nearly every inch of its faded green paint. A few minutes later, she found an elderly man standing beside the barn. He appeared to be studying the building rather than waiting for someone. The stranger was tall despite his age, nearly 6 feet 2 inches, with a lean frame that had clearly once been powerful. His thick white hair extended slightly past his collar, and a neatly trimmed white beard framed a weathered face marked by decades of sun exposure. His gray eyes seemed unusually alert, carrying the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing more than speaking. When Abigail approached, the man smiled. "You must be Ethan's daughter." Abigail stopped. Few strangers spoke her father's name that way. "Yes," she replied carefully. The man extended his hand. "Henry Dawson." The name meant nothing to her, at least initially. Then Henry glanced toward the hills. "I haven't been here in almost 20 years. Abigail frowned. "You knew my father?" Henry laughed softly. "Knew him?" He shook his head. "We spent nearly 30 years chasing the same mystery." The words immediately caught her attention. Within an hour, the two sat inside the ranch house. Old maps covered the kitchen table. Henry slowly removed several weathered folders from a leather briefcase. The briefcase itself looked almost as old as the truck. "Your father asked me to give these to you someday." Abigail stared. "What?" Henry nodded. "He never knew when, but he was certain you'd eventually need them." For several seconds, she simply looked at the folders. Then she opened the first one. Inside were geological surveys, water measurements, ecosystem reports, satellite photographs, research papers. Some documents dated back nearly 3 decades. Others contained notes written jointly by Ethan Turner and Henry Dawson. Abigail felt her heartbeat quicken. "What is all this?" Henry leaned back. The answer came slowly. "The work your father spent most of his life protecting." Abigail listened as Henry explained. In his younger years, Henry had been one of Montana's most respected field geologists. During the 1980s, he worked on groundwater projects throughout the western United States. Unlike many scientists who focused only on reports and data, Henry spent months living in remote areas studying how ecosystems actually functioned. That was how he met Ethan Turner. At first, they disagreed constantly. One was a scientist. The other was a rancher. But over time, they discovered something important. They were both seeing the same problem. Water was disappearing across large portions of eastern Montana. Most people focused on short-term profits. Ethan focused on sustainability. Together, they began studying the region. For almost 30 years, Abigail spent hours reviewing the documents. The deeper she read, the more shocked she became. The aquifer beneath Turner Ranch represented only part of the story. According to the research, the groundwater system connected to an entire network of springs, wetlands, and grazing areas stretching across thousands of acres. The ecosystem functioned like a living organism. Damage one part, the entire system suffered. Protect it, everything benefited. Henry pointed toward one of the maps. "Your father understood this before almost anyone else." Abigail stared at the markings. Many matched the notes she discovered in Ethan's notebooks. Suddenly, everything began making sense. The grazing plans, the water management, the land purchases, even the sections of property people once called worthless. None of it had been accidental. Ethan wasn't simply running a ranch. He was protecting an ecosystem. Henry removed one final envelope from his briefcase. Unlike the others, it remained sealed. The handwriting on the front belonged to Ethan. Abigail immediately recognized it. For Abigail, "Open when you finally understand." Tears filled her eyes. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. Inside rested a single letter. The message was short. "My greatest fear was never losing the ranch. It was losing the knowledge. If you're reading this, then you've already discovered what truly matters. Protect the land, Abigail. It will protect generations after we're gone." Silence filled the room. Outside, cattle moved peacefully across the pastures. Inside, Abigail finally understood something that had taken her father decades to learn. The aquifer was never the treasure. The land itself was. And her father had spent nearly 30 years making sure someone would be ready to protect it when he no longer could. A warm summer breeze moved through the Montana grasslands while golden sunlight stretched across the rolling hills surrounding Turner Ranch, and distant cattle grazed beneath an endless blue sky. The discovery beneath Turner Ranch had changed Abigail Turner's life, but not in the way most people expected. Many believed she would eventually sell. Others assumed she would become wealthy by leasing water rights or partnering with investors. Some thought she would leave Montana entirely. Abigail chose a different path. She stayed. One evening, she sat alone inside the old barn, surrounded by Ethan's notebooks and Henry Dawson's research files. The setting sun poured through the wooden walls, illuminating pages that represented nearly 30 years of her father's life. For a long time, she studied a sentence Ethan had written repeatedly throughout different notebooks. "Healthy land creates healthy cattle. Healthy cattle create healthy families. Healthy families create healthy communities. The words seemed simple. Yet the older Abigail became, the more she understood them. Instead of selling land, she began investing in it. Every major decision over the next decade traced back to something Ethan had documented. She redesigned grazing patterns, expanded pasture rotation, protected natural wetlands, limited overgrazing, restored damaged sections of prairie, planted drought-resistant grasses recommended in Ethan's records. Many neighboring ranchers considered her methods unnecessarily complicated. Some openly mocked them. At first, then the results began appearing. Year after year, during dry seasons, Turner Ranch remained productive. During difficult winters, cattle losses stayed remarkably low. Feed costs dropped. Soil quality improved. Water retention increased. By the fifth year, agricultural universities were sending students to study the ranch. By the seventh year, researchers were publishing reports based on Ethan's methods. By the 10th year, Turner Ranch had become one of the most efficient cattle operations in Montana. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, the most efficient. Abigail considered that a greater achievement. One afternoon, she received a visit from a woman named Rachel Monroe. Rachel was 38 years old, tall and athletic, with dark auburn hair tied neatly behind her head and intelligent brown eyes that constantly analyzed everything around her. As an agricultural economist working for Montana State University, Rachel had spent years studying why some ranches thrived while others failed. Growing up on a struggling family farm had made her deeply interested in sustainable agriculture rather than short-term profits. After touring the property, Rachel sat with Abigail beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree. "I've reviewed your numbers," Rachel said. Abigail smiled. "Good or bad?" Rachel laughed. "Honestly, confusing." Abigail raised an eyebrow. Rachel opened a folder. "Most ranches improve one area and sacrifice another. Yours improves everything at the same time." The economist pointed toward the pastures. "Better cattle health, lower feed costs, higher soil quality, stronger drought resistance." She shook her head. "I've rarely seen anything like it." Abigail knew exactly why. Because the system wasn't hers. It was Ethan's. She simply followed it. As the years passed, Turner Ranch continued expanding carefully. Abigail purchased neighboring properties only when they fit into the ecological system her father envisioned. She refused rapid growth, refused unnecessary debt, refused shortcuts. Those decisions frustrated many consultants. Yet they protected the ranch. Eventually, even the people who once doubted her began changing their opinions. Marvin Holt became one of her strongest supporters. Luke Dawson often collaborated with her on grazing projects throughout the county. Several younger ranchers started copying portions of Ethan's methods. The greatest surprise came during a statewide agricultural conference. Hundreds of ranchers attended. Researchers presented studies. Industry leaders delivered speeches. Near the end of the event, Abigail received an award recognizing Turner Ranch as one of the most innovative and sustainable cattle operations in Montana. As applause filled the room, she felt strangely uncomfortable, because she knew the recognition belonged elsewhere. That evening she returned home. The award sat untouched on the kitchen table. Instead, Abigail walked into the barn. The same barn where she discovered the wooden chest years earlier. The same barn where Ethan spent countless nights recording observations nobody else valued. She opened one of his notebooks. Near the back appeared a sentence she had highlighted long ago. "Success is not measured by what you take from the land. It's measured by what remains after you're gone." Abigail sat quietly for several minutes. Outside, cattle moved across healthy pastures. Water flowed through systems her father designed. Grasslands flourished where drought once threatened everything. Turner Ranch had become one of Montana's greatest success stories. Yet as she looked across the property through the barn window, Abigail understood something few people ever learned. The ranch succeeded not because her father discovered water. It succeeded because he spent 30 years learning how to protect everything connected to it. And now, 10 years after standing alone in that bank, Abigail had finally fulfilled the future Ethan Turner spent his life preparing her to build. A cool autumn breeze moved across the Montana prairie while golden grass swayed beneath a clear blue sky, and distant cattle wandered peacefully across the hills surrounding Turner Ranch. Nearly 12 years had passed since Abigail Turner first walked into the First Montana Agricultural Bank asking for a loan. 12 years since people laughed. 12 years since they told her to sell. Now things were different. Turner Ranch had become one of the most respected agricultural operations in the state. Ranchers traveled hundreds of miles to learn from her management system. University students studied Ethan Turner's records. Government agencies occasionally consulted Abigail when discussing sustainable water management. Yet despite everything she had accomplished, she rarely thought about the bank anymore. That chapter of her life felt distant. Until one October afternoon, Abigail was inspecting a newly restored pasture near the southern boundary when she noticed a familiar vehicle entering the ranch. An older sedan, well-maintained, conservative, the kind of vehicle driven by someone who preferred reliability over appearance. When it stopped near the barn, an elderly man slowly stepped out. For a moment, Abigail didn't recognize him. Then she did. Gerald Whitaker, the banker. Time had changed him. The sharp, confident lending director she remembered had become a much older man. His silver hair had turned almost completely white. Deep wrinkles lined his face. His posture had softened, and the careful confidence he once carried seemed replaced by something quieter. Humility. Gerald stood beside the car for several moments before approaching. He looked nervous. Abigail had never imagined seeing that. At 64, she realized people carried different burdens than they did at 52. As he reached her, Gerald removed his hat. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." Abigail smiled politely. "I wasn't sure you'd come." The answer surprised him. A faint smile appeared on his face. For several moments, neither spoke. The wind moved through the grass around them. Finally, Gerald broke the silence. "I retired last year." Abigail nodded. "I heard." The former banker looked toward the cattle, then toward the distant irrigation systems, then toward the healthy pastures. Everywhere he looked, evidence of success surrounded him. Success he once believed impossible. "I owe you an apology." The words came quietly, without excuses, without qualifications. Abigail simply listened. Gerald took a slow breath. "When you came into my office all those years ago, I thought I was being practical." His eyes lowered. "I told myself I was protecting the bank." He laughed bitterly. "Truth is, I judged you before I ever reviewed your potential." Abigail remained silent. Gerald continued. "I saw a young woman. I saw someone grieving. I saw risk." His voice softened. "I never stopped to see determination." The admission clearly cost him something. For decades, Gerald Whitaker had built his reputation on making good decisions. Accepting that one of his most important judgments had been wrong wasn't easy. They walked slowly toward the barn. The same barn where Ethan's notebooks remained stored. The same barn where Abigail's future had quietly begun. Inside, sunlight streamed through the wooden walls. Dust floated lazily through the air. Gerald stopped as Abigail approached an old cabinet. From inside, she carefully removed one of Ethan's notebooks. Then another, and another. Without saying a word, she placed them on the workbench. Gerald looked confused. "What are these?" "My father's work." He opened the first notebook. Then another. Then another. Minutes passed. The pages contained rainfall records, groundwater measurements, grazing studies, ecological observations. Year after year, decade after decade. The deeper Gerald read, the quieter he became. Eventually he sat down. Neither spoke. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes. Abigail simply watched. For the first time, someone else was seeing what she discovered years earlier. Not the water, not the wealth, the commitment, the sacrifice, the vision. Finally, Gerald closed the notebook. His eyes looked different, as though he had just met Ethan Turner for the first time. "I understand now." Abigail nodded. "So do I." The old banker stared at the weathered pages. "For 30 years your father was building something nobody else could see." Abigail smiled softly. "Exactly." Gerald looked toward her. "You know what bothers me most?" She waited. "I thought I was evaluating a ranch." His voice became almost a whisper. "I never realized I was evaluating 30 years of knowledge." The words hung in the air. Outside, cattle moved peacefully through the pasture. Inside, the old banker sat quietly before the notebooks. For a long time, neither person spoke. No argument remained. No resentment. No need to revisit the past. Because the apology was never really about the loan. It was about recognizing value before the world recognized it. And as Gerald finally stood to leave, Abigail felt no satisfaction in being proven right, only gratitude. Because her father, a man most people overlooked during his lifetime, had finally been understood. A gentle autumn breeze moved through the endless Montana grasslands while golden sunlight stretched across the horizon and thousands of acres of healthy pasture shimmered beneath the evening sky. 30 years had passed since the day Abigail Turner walked into a bank and was told to sell her father's ranch. 30 years since she stood alone. 30 years since people looked at a grieving young woman and saw failure. Now, at 51 years old, Abigail had become something few people ever achieve. A legend, not because she sought fame, not because she chased wealth, but because she spent 3 decades proving that patience, wisdom, and faith could outlast almost anything. Turner Ranch now stretched across more than 2,000 acres of carefully managed land. What had once been a struggling operation on the verge of collapse had become one of the most respected ranches in the American West. Agricultural universities still studied its management system. Government agencies still referenced Ethan Turner's environmental research. Young ranchers regularly traveled hundreds of miles hoping to learn from Abigail. Many arrived expecting to meet a wealthy businesswoman. Instead, they met someone remarkably similar to her father. Age had softened Abigail's appearance, but strengthened her presence. Silver strands now mixed with her dark blonde hair, which she still wore pulled back most days. Fine lines surrounded her green eyes, earned through years of hard work, laughter, grief, and perseverance. She carried herself with calm confidence, never needing to prove anything to anyone. The ranch house had changed very little. The barn remained standing. The pastures remained healthy. The notebooks remained exactly where they had always been. Every evening after finishing her work, Abigail followed the same ritual. She walked into the old barn, opened the wooden cabinet, and removed one particular notebook. The final notebook, the last one Ethan Turner ever wrote. On most nights, she didn't read the entire thing. She didn't need to. She already knew every page, every map, every observation, every lesson. Instead, she always turned to the final message. The same message she first read decades earlier. If one day I'm no longer here, trust this land. It is stronger than people think. She read those words every evening, not because she feared forgetting them, because they reminded her of who she was. One October afternoon, a group of agricultural students arrived for a ranch tour. Among them was a young woman named Claire Morrison. Claire was 22 years old, tall and lean with curly brown hair, bright hazel eyes, and the restless energy of someone eager to prove herself. Growing up on a small family farm that struggled financially, she often questioned whether agriculture still had a future. Like Abigail decades earlier, she constantly found herself fighting doubt. After the tour ended, Claire remained behind. She seemed hesitant, nervous. Finally, she asked a question. What was the most important thing your father left you? Abigail looked across the pasture. Thousands of acres stretched toward the horizon. Water flowed through systems Ethan helped design. Healthy cattle grazed beneath the Montana sky. The answer should have been obvious. Yet it wasn't. It wasn't the ranch, Abigail said. Claire looked surprised. It wasn't. Abigail smiled. No. The water. Again, Abigail shook her head. No. The land. Still no. For several moments, the younger woman looked confused. Then Abigail led her into the barn. She opened the familiar cabinet, removed the weathered notebook, and placed it gently into Claire's hands. This. Claire carefully opened the cover. The pages looked ordinary. Old. Worn. Nothing special. At least at first glance. Abigail watched her study the notebook, then quietly said the words she had spent 30 years learning. My father didn't leave me a ranch. He left me belief. Claire slowly looked up. Abigail continued. When everyone else saw problems, he taught me to look for possibilities. When everyone else saw worthless land, he taught me to look deeper. When everyone else told me to quit, he taught me to trust what I knew. Silence filled the barn. Outside, wind moved gently through the prairie grass. Inside, Claire listened carefully. For a moment, Abigail almost saw herself standing there again. Young, scared, uncertain, wondering whether she was strong enough. As the sun began setting, she placed the notebook back inside the cabinet. The same place it had rested for decades. The same place it would remain long after she was gone. Because the greatest inheritance Ethan Turner left behind was never measured in acres, never measured in water, never measured in money. It was measured in lives changed, in courage passed forward, in faith carried from one generation to the next. And as Abigail looked across the land her father loved so deeply, she understood one final truth. The ranch had survived because of water, but the legacy had survived because of belief. Sometimes, God's miracles do not arrive as sudden fortunes, perfect opportunities, or easy roads. Sometimes they arrive disguised as hardship, a closed door that forces us to find a better path, a season of struggle that teaches us strength we never knew we possessed, a piece of wisdom left behind by someone who loved us long before we understood its value. When Abigail lost her father, she believed she had lost everything. But God was already working through seeds planted decades earlier, through a father's faith, through years of unseen preparation, through knowledge carefully preserved for the day it would be needed most. And perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons in life. Many of us are facing battles that nobody else can see. Some are worried about money. Some are carrying grief. Some are waiting for answers that never seem to come. And some are standing in front of challenges so large they wonder if they will ever overcome them. But this story reminds us that God is often working beneath the surface, just like the water hidden beneath Abigail's land. We may not see his plan today. We may not understand why certain doors close. We may not know why the journey feels so difficult. Yet sometimes the greatest blessings are already being prepared long before we discover them. So if you are going through a difficult season, do not give up. Keep moving forward. Keep believing. Keep planting seeds of faith, kindness, and perseverance. One day, you may discover that God was guiding your story all along. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what lesson spoke to you the most. And if you enjoy stories of faith, hope, perseverance, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. May God bless you, your family, your home, and every dream you are still working toward. May He give you strength in difficult seasons, peace in uncertain times, and hope for the road ahead. And may you never forget that some of God's greatest miracles are already growing beneath the surface, even when you cannot see them yet.